Greetings and welcome to all of you. I'm Pastor Timothy Muse, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. And it's a joy to be with you today as we spend this time in our 33rd session on Paul's letter to the Romans. If you are joining us for the first time, then welcome to the series, welcome to the sessions. I certainly would encourage you to go back and read some of the previous sessions, hear some of the previous sessions, so you can get caught up in where we are. If you've been walking along with us, then welcome back. It's great to have you as part of this journey, part of this time together. I would encourage you to have a Bible open before you, whether it's in a printed form or in a digital form. That's up to you, whatever works best for you. But I would encourage you to have a Bible open before you so that you can follow along and see what's going on and keep up with what is being written, what is being spoken. One of the things that I'm a big advocate for, obviously, is biblical literacy. The ability to not only read the Bible, but know what's in it and know what's not in it. You know, in our world, it can become very easy to believe or think that something is in the Bible that really isn't in the Bible. So biblical literacy is an important aspect of making sure that we maintain and participate in and work through our life of faith. So being able to read the Bible, knowing what's in the Bible. So I certainly encourage you to have a Bible open before you. And I would encourage you to read the Bible every day. I would. I mean, it's one of the things that I've always advocated for, and I'm going to continue to advocate for. I would encourage you to open your Bible every day. Now, there's a lot of directed ways to read the Bible, a lot of directed places to read the Bible. If you're not sure what to do, then open to the Psalms and start reading the first Psalm. There's 150 Psalms in the book of in the Holy Scriptures, so that's half a year if you read a Psalm a day. And Psalm 119 is pretty huge, so you can break that up into 26 days. So you can probably spend almost an entire year reading through the Psalms. So I encourage you to read the Bible. I really do. I encourage you to open your Bible every day. It is our primary text. It is our primary storytelling of what God is doing in the world. So read it every day. It's primary and it's really important. So I encourage that. I encourage that out of you. So we're in chapter 13 now. We're beginning chapter 13, and we're at a point where Paul has been spending a lot of time talking about big issues, Jews and Gentiles, who's in, who's out. You know, last one he talked about, taking care of your body, living by grace. He's talked about not thinking too highly of yourself, hate what is evil. So really, I mean, some core living values. So we're going to see him. We're going to see him move again. And as Romans wraps up, and we're almost finished with the book here. You know, the book only goes to chapter 16. I think that's chapter 16. As I look at chapter 16. So we only have a couple more chapters left. But we're going to see Paul now kind of sprinkle in a number of different things that are important for the Christian to live in the world. Again, and I've said this before, keep in mind, we as believers today have 2,000 years of Christian history. We have 2,000 years of theology. We have 2,000 years of work. The people that Paul is writing to didn't. They didn't know what it meant to live as a Christian in the world. Paul's figuring this out as he goes. So it's important for us to grasp, to acknowledge that what we're seeing here, what we're getting here, is Paul's work around how to be a Christian. He's laying the foundation here. He's laying the foundation here, and we're going to see he's going to sprinkle in a few other things as he wraps up this letter on how to live as a Christian in the world. And today we're going to kind of grapple with a pretty big issue, and one that again, as we look at our own life of faith, there's a lot of things that Paul writes about in Romans that still rings true for us today. So this is chapter 13. A whole new avenue now. Paul talked about what it meant to live in community, how to get along with people, interactive, not repaying evil for you. Now Paul is going to shift. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rules are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is in the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be judgment. One must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason, you must pay your taxes. For the authorities are God's servant, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. Okay, so first thing to keep in mind, Paul is writing to a group of people who are living in Rome, who are living under a pagan Roman authority. Soon after, if not already, it's kind of hard to tell how early Rome sees Christianity as a threat. But soon, Rome and the Roman emperors will start deploying the military to go out and eradicate the Christians. Rome sees Christianity as a threat. So here is Paul saying, be subject to authority. Be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So this is a hard pill to swallow, but I want to make sure that we keep something in perspective here. Okay, so what Paul is telling the Christians in Rome to do is not to buck the authority of the Roman emperor. Why is that? Well, yes, the Roman government is creating and executing oppressive behaviors, of course. And any part of Christians is to bring about justice. However, if the Christians in Rome cause a rebellion, if the Christians in Rome fight against the Roman Empire, what's going to happen? They're going to be squashed. They're going to be eradicated. The fledgling community that is growing in Rome would be wiped out before it even has a chance to grow. So what Paul is saying here is don't be rebellious. Christianity, and this is really a hard thing, but Christianity was never really meant to be a rebellious religion. It was never really meant to be a rebellious belief structure. It was actually meant to be an insidious belief structure. Insidious as in that it gets a hold of something and it replicates and grows. And ultimately, Christianity does overthrow the Roman Empire, but not through violence. We talked about this before. Not through violence, not through aggression, but by baptism, by faith proclamation, by replication of believers over and over and over again. Paul doesn't want the Christian to be a rebellion or a rebellious entity because it would serve no good. It would not serve the mission. This does not mean that everything that the governing authorities is put forward is to be celebrated. Okay, we can follow the law without necessarily liking the law, but understanding that if we don't follow the law, it is detrimental to God's mission, not upholding God's mission. There's a point, and Martin Luther really kind of brings this about more fully in his article on secular authority. Where he talks about it is the responsibility of the Christian to follow the law of the land. That's what Paul is saying here. Until the law of the land requires the Christian to break the law of God. And Paul would agree with this. Then the Christian is to follow the law of God and accept the punishment of the law of the land. Martin Luther would never talk about changing the law of the land, if you will, but understanding that the law of the land is in place for a reason, but the Christian is bound by the law of the land only as far as it does not require the Christian to break the law of God. Putting this in the Roman Emperor's perspective, the Roman Empire's perspective, a Christian is not meant to be rebellious in the eyes of the Roman Empire. A Christian is not meant to bring about governmental rebellion. A Christian is to bow down and understand the role of the authority of the government. This does not mean that the Christian has to accept it, but to acknowledge that there is a process and a formula. And if things need to change, it doesn't need to change through violent rebellion. It needs to change through replication. It needs to change through faith proclamation. It needs to change through the workings of God. And it does. It took a long time for the Roman Empire. And yes, Christians died in the process. But ultimately Rome fell to the Christians and not through a violent uprising. So the Christian isn't meant to be a rebellious entity in the Roman Empire. Follow the law, do what is right. Now there's a moment where in Rome the Roman Empire was believed to be the Son of God, and it was required of everyone to bow down to the Son of God. So this is where things get sticky. This is where the Roman emperor starts to have an issue with the Christians, as they won't bow down. This is a point where the belief structure of the Christian faith, bowing down to Christ, worship God and serve Him alone, well, you can't do that and bow down to the Roman emperor. So the Christian will bow down to God, and that is what's expected, is the Christian to bow down to God. Does this anger the Roman emperor? Yes. Would the Roman emperor maybe even put someone to death for it? Yes. Is the Christian meant to overthrow the Roman emperor? No. The Christian is meant to follow their faith, even if their faith costs them their life. This is the context. We as humans have this idea that we want to spare our life at all cost, even if that means we sacrifice our belief structure. But in the Christian realm, death is not the worst thing that can happen to a Christian. And I know that's hard to hear, but this is what Bible study is all about, is to engage these hard ideas. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to a Christian. To live by denying the Savior is worse than dying to protect the Savior and proclaiming faith. So what Paul is arguing here is Paul is not arguing to usurp the government. Paul is not arguing to overthrow the government. Will there be a time when the Christian has to make a stand? Absolutely. Would that stand maybe cost them their life? Absolutely. Is that problematic? Yeah, it is problematic. However, that's just part of the journey of faith. Is the Christian called to No. Paul doesn't want to see the early church. I mean, think about it. Think about it from a practical perspective. You know, the church in Rome has like maybe 40 or 50 people in it, and 40 or 50 people try to rebel and overthrow the Roman government in the name of Christ. What's going to happen? Roman government's going to win. That's just how it's going to work out. If you think about the Passion Sunday, when Jesus strolls into Jerusalem on the back of the donkey, think about that. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they tell Jesus to disperse the crowd. Well, partly they want Jesus to disperse the crowd because they don't want Jesus to be proclaimed as king, of course. But the other aspect is that Rome is very attentive to crowds. And so there was some concern that the Roman Empire would come in and just crush the Jews because they were gathering a crowd, proclaiming a king. You don't proclaim a king in the midst of an empire that's ruling you. That's sedition. That's seen as something negative. So they were concerned that Rome was going to come in and wipe them out. So, and that would be Paul's concern as well. Paul would be concerned that if the Christians in Rome rose up, well, they'd be eradicated. They'd be eliminated. You know, look, and it's not long after Paul's letter to the Romans that the Jews in Jerusalem rise up against the Romans, and the temple is destroyed. 70 A.D., the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed because the Jews, they rebelled against Rome. And Rome won. Rome was just massive. I mean, the technological and the military power of Rome at the height of their empire was just unstoppable. So Paul isn't, and here's the thing, Paul isn't saying that as a Christian we are to put our stamp on the government, say that the government is doing it right, say that the government is all powerful and is getting it all right. No, what Paul is saying here, clearly what Paul is saying is follow the law. As long as the law doesn't make you break the law of God, follow the law, because that is the way that you live in peace. That is the way this ministry grows. That is the way it is overcome and overthrown. It took 325 years, but Christianity did overthrow the Roman government. Again, not through war or violence, but through replication, baptism, faith proclamation, and peace. Okay? Whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. So for Paul understands the ultimate sovereignty of God. Paul understands the ultimate authority of God, and the proclamation is that those who are in authority are placed there by God. Or if nothing else, God is not stopping it from happening. And I think in a lot of ways, and now again, and this is not to say we need to be very careful, even in our world today, we need to be very careful to not proclaim a leader as divinely ordained. And here in the United States, we don't divinely ordain our leaders. We elect them. We elect them through campaigning, and then people vote. It is not God who is necessarily pointing the finger at one particular and saying, that's the one. Is God's work at hand in campaigning? Is God's hand at work in the election? Of course, because we believe and we have believers who are voting. So therefore, God's hand is at work. I mean, God's hand is at work because I vote and I'm a believer and I look to my faith in order to guide my choices. Okay. But our leaders are not divinely ordained. Like when we look in the Old Testament at the kings like Saul or David or Solomon or what have you. But the leaders, God has appointed it. Now, and this is where it gets really, really difficult. This is where it gets really, really hard. Again, Paul is not condoning, that's the word I was looking for. Paul is not condoning the leadership style. Paul is not condoning the work of the Roman emperor. What Paul is doing is saying that Rome is in power right now. If God is in the works of it, then somewhere, somehow, God is allowing this power to exist for this period of time. This power will overrun and destroy this fledgling community. So be at peace with it until something else comes along, and something does come along. But for now, be at peace with it. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. Look, the only time the government pays attention is when you're not doing good. And I think that's the truth today. You know, we have this big thing called the IRS, all right, and the Internal Revenue Service, and they're like the big cudgel in the room. They like to walk around, smacking people over the head with this big mountain of fear. Everybody's so afraid of the IRS. The only reason why you're afraid of the IRS is if you're not doing what's right. Do what's right, and you won't live in fear. You live in peace. Again, and Paul's ultimate desire is that the believer lives in peace. Because it is in peace that we're able to proclaim. We're not able to proclaim Christ crucified when we're living in fear of the IRS showing up to take everything that we have. If we want to live in peace, then do what is right. Even if it doesn't look right. Okay, and this is the thing. This is where we have to look at the cross. Let's look at the cross for just a minute. The cross was the right thing to do, even if it doesn't look right. It looks awful, but it was the right thing to do. When we pay our taxes, which Paul talks about in a little bit, when we follow the law, we do it because it's the right thing to do, even if it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. I'll give you a perfect example. When I lived in Canton, on Sunday morning I would drive out. Now anybody who's familiar with Canton, we lived over by the fairgrounds, okay? They're on 3rd Street and Worth. So I'd drive down 3rd Street, turn left on Worth to get up onto 62 to come to work. Well, you know what? It's 6 o'clock in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, sitting at that light there at 3rd Street and Worth. Okay, I'm sitting there looking at a red light, all right? There's no traffic coming the other way. And it's a long red light. It takes time to turn green. Now, I could have gone through that red light, and I could have driven along, and nobody would have been hurt. It would have affected nobody at all. But that wouldn't have been the right thing to do. And though I could have possibly gotten punished. I could have turned left and run that red light only to have a police officer, sitting down in the parking lot having a cup of coffee watching me do it. It's very possible. But the other thing is it's just not the right thing to do. We receive approval because we do the right thing. The only time that anybody ever pays attention is when we do it wrong. That police officer sitting down, if there's a police officer sitting down in that parking lot and I wait till the light turns green and I turn left, he or she's not even paying attention. But if I run the red light, then they are. It is when we do wrong that the governing authorities usually pay attention, not when we do right. And it doesn't matter how many right things we do. If we do something wrong, it's going to be raised up. That's just the way life is. So Paul is saying here, look, if you wish to live without fear of the authority, then do what is good, and you will receive the approval. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. The authority does not bear the sword in vain. In other words, the authority's not walking around just cutting people up because it wants to, imposing the law because it wants to. It's doing what it's called to do and what has the authority to do. So if you don't want to fear the sword, then do what is right, even if you don't agree with it. And this is where we need to get into a lot of that kind of moral and ethical basis. There are things that we as Christians stand up and rebel against. Of course, there are things that we speak out against, injustices that we speak out against. Length of a red light is not something that we speak out against. Running a red light is not something we do because we're in a hurry. Okay? The Christian, as far as it is possible, we live in peace with each other, which means that we do what is right. If we do what is wrong, then we should be afraid, because we're not following what God is asking us to follow. And if we do what is wrong, then we do it out of choice for God. If we're going to stand against the authority for whatever reason, it needs to be a choice for God and for God's law and for God's will and for God's protection, not just our own desiring. Running that red light that I talked about earlier, there's nothing gospel about that. So I have no legitimate reason to stand against the authority of the state or the government to run that red light. I can't crouch that in any kind of God stuff. But if I'm sitting at that red light while someone is actively dying at the hospital, that's different. So follow the government. Follow the authority as best as possible. Are there times to rise up against it? Yes, of course. But as best as possible, as it is presented, live in peace. Live in peace. And if one can't live in peace, if there's something that needs to be risen up against, then rise up against it, but understand that there's going to be consequences. Paul does. Paul stands against the authority, and there's consequences. He goes to jail. He gets beaten. He gets shipwrecked, and ultimately he loses his head. But he's willing to do that for the sake of the gospel. One must be subject not because of wrath, but also because of conscience. It's, again, and when we talk about the use of the law, as Martin Luther would talk about it, Martin Luther would say that there's three uses of the law. The first use of the law is that we follow the law because we don't want to get in trouble. That's where most people are at. You sit at that red light because you don't want to get a ticket. Right? That's the first use of the law. Second use of the law comes down to conscience. I sit at the red light because it's the right thing to do. And I want to feel good about myself. So it's the right thing to do. So I'm going to follow the law because I want to feel good about myself. I want my conscience to be at ease. I don't want to be driving out to church on Sunday morning, talk about confession and forgiveness and proclamation. No, and I ran a red light because I was too impatient to wait for it. Conscience. It's more than just getting in trouble. It's about where we stand, where we lie, where we are, what we feel. And then the third use of the law is I follow the law because I want God to be happy with me. I want God to look with favor upon me. This is what Paul is talking about. We want God to look with favor upon us. So we follow that which is laid forth on us until it gets to the point where it is asking us to break God's law. Then we follow God's law, but also we accept the consequences of breaking the law. That's the big thing. If the law of the land requires us to break the law of God and we follow the law of God, we have to be willing to accept the consequences of that. Even if that consequence is our life. Going back to Rome, there are many who lived in Rome who wouldn't bow down to the Roman emperor, who wouldn't call the Roman emperor God, and who gave up their life for it. But they were willing to do that. That was a God thing. Paul says, live in peace, as much as it is possible. For the same reason, this would be the reason of conscience, this would be the reason to do the right thing, pay taxes. Pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them. And again, when we think about it from an individual perspective, okay, I can manipulate my taxes here a little bit, and I can cheat on my tax. I can take this deduction or that deduction. I mean, there's a lot that we can do, but ultimately, at the end of the day, when we do that, all we do is then either we don't care or we live under, well, I hope that the IRS doesn't pay attention. Well, that's a pretty hefty hope, because they do pay attention. When it comes to money, that's pretty much the one thing that the government really pays attention about. Pay your taxes. This is what it means to live in the land that we live in. If you don't want to pay your taxes, then live somewhere else. Or be prepared to accept the consequences. But then how does that public image, there's a public image that we have as Christians, how does that public image come out if we're not paying our taxes? If we're not paying what is due? The same would be true with, pay revenue to whom revenue is due. We don't cheat, we don't steal, we don't take things for free. If we owe people money, we owe it to them. If someone has done us a service, then we pay them. If someone is providing a good, then we pay for it. If someone deserves wages, then we pay them. This is how we have a good conscience. And a good conscience leads to peace and a good proclamation. This is what we do. This is what it means to live as a Christian in the world. Respect to whom respect is due. Honor to whom honor is due. These things are important. You see, what Paul is talking about here is Paul's talking about laying both a private but also a public proclamation. There's a public proclamation. There isn't a church on every corner like we experience today. There's a public proclamation that needs to be laid forth here. So be a Christian, and once you're a Christian, you'll have to pay your taxes. You think Rome is going to be happy about that? No. Rome is just like the country is today. Rome is heavy on money. They pay attention to two things: rebellion and money. Pay your taxes. Live in peace. Now, is the tax, again, and we can ask it today, is the tax burden too much for us to bear? Maybe it is. How do you change that? You get involved. A violent uprising isn't going to change the tax law. You get involved. You get involved in local civic groups. You get involved in local elections. You get involved. How do you change what needs to be changed? You change from within, through replication, faith proclamation, not through violence. Paul doesn't see Christianity as a violent movement. Paul sees Christianity as a movement of peace, changing peace. I'm not, for those of you who are familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and that whole kind of world, that whole universe, and the battle of good and evil. The evil that was told in that story wasn't paying attention to the work of the good, because the work of the good was doing it small, non-violently. They were paying attention to the warriors. They were paying attention to the aggression. But they weren't paying attention to the small. They weren't paying attention to the little hobbit carrying the ring to the mountain until it was too late. Paul doesn't see Christianity as a violent movement. Paul sees Christianity as a movement that changes one person at a time. And through that change, sooner or later, The Christian finds themselves in the Roman Senate, finds themselves in the House of Representatives, finds themselves in the White House. Not through violence, but through peace and growth. So Paul is encouraging the people in Rome, the believers in Rome, to live a life that doesn't represent violence, that doesn't represent rebellion. Again, you do not have to condone something to follow its directive. You don't. You have to, you can work through it, but if you condemn something, if you stand against it, if it has the power to crush you, it will. And then nothing is gained. Nothing is gained. Paul wants to see Christianity grow. Paul wants to see the proclamation of Christ grow, but not through violence. Christianity is not a violent growth process. And faith isn't forced. Relationships aren't forced. Now, there's so much more that we can dig into this. I mean, yes, there are ethical and moral understandings of leadership and governmental authority, and we can question all that, and we can speak out against it. This does not mean that fortunately in our world, we can, as a church, speak out against oppression and injustice. We have the capability of doing that. That doesn't mean that we're usurpers of the government. That just means that we're questioning some areas of authority. Now, if we start to question ultimate authority of governmental structure, that's a whole different scenario. But it really boils down to this. And there are governments in this world that and leaders in this world who are doing some pretty awful things. Does God ordain them? Is that authority from God? The devil is certainly at work, and evil is certainly at work in the world too. And that needs to be acknowledged and raised up. Because sometimes evil does win the battle, but not always going to win the war. Paul's understanding of the global context is obviously pretty small. We have a much bigger understanding of the global context, and there's a lot more global context to it. And so we could go much deeper into a dialogue around global context and global leaders and who is ordained by God and who's God's authority and who isn't God's authority. And there's a lot that can come with that too. We're not going to do that here, not right now anyway. Maybe sometime down the road. But I need to dig a whole lot deeper in that before I can bring it to you. What Paul is saying here is this: as believers in Rome, don't start a violent uprising. Don't rebel against the government. They will crush you, and the mission of the church will be done. It does not mean that you need to condone bowing down to the Roman emperor. There are some things that are worth dying for, but just outright rebellion is not. Bow down. And maybe even not bow down, but just follow the law. Be subject to it. And you're going to live in peace. And as you live in peace, then you're going to be able to affect your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor. And while you're not fighting the forces of the Roman government, you're able to proselytize all those around you. That's how change happens. Change doesn't happen through force. Change happens through changed ideologies and knowledge. Paul knew that, and we still know it today. We still know it today. All right, my friends, I'm going to leave it here for now. There's a lot to that, and there's even more. Maybe I'll try to wrap back around a little bit more next time, but I'm just going to leave it here for the moment. And as always, my contact information will come up at the end of the session. If you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll do the best I can to answer them, either in the next session or directly. But these are some weighty things. I get it. These are some weighty things. And Paul is throwing some things out there and things that we still wrestle with. And that's okay. In a life of faith, we're supposed to wrestle with it. The moment it stops challenging us is the moment that it stops becoming a journey. And it's just something that we're comfortable with. And we should never just be comfortable with our faith. We should always be challenged by it because it is a journey. It's a journey to the grave, but onto the other side of the grave to everlasting life. So, my brothers and sisters, have a great day. Whatever it brings to you, have a great day. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you next time.